we're very happy you could find time and join us today and speak to us a little bit. How can the current economic system be reformed to prevent economic crisis?
What was done in the last couple of years by the president was to shove a lot of money into the economy. And as a result, the economy grew, but it's unsustainable growth. It's not based on anything real. It's just you put more money in people's hands, they start spending more money, but somebody has to do something to fix up the production end of things. So the real things are made. Also, people get confused between what I'd call the financial economy and the real economy. The stock market going up doesn't mean anything in particular about people's lives and how well they live. Financial end of things is important because it supplies, it moves capital from people who have extra money and don't know what to do with it but want to earn some sort of return, to people who have great ideas but they don't have the money to implement them. And that's what the financial sector is supposed to do. What it has been doing since before the crash of 2007, 2008 is inventing different kinds of securities, and people just selling these things and moving them back and forth to each other has no connection to the real economy, except when it messed up the banking system, because these securities were not properly created. There's a lot of fraud, but certainly a lot of fast dealing that didn't do good things for the financial economy. And because the financial economy is so important to the real economy, it had a really bad impact, almost sent the world into another Great Depression. The United States actually has suffered a lot of its industrial losses. You know, in the United States, we've argued for some time that manufacturing was going downhill. And it turns out that one of the reasons for that is that the military sector of the United States, which is so large, has taken a fairly large percentage of the engineers and scientists who develop new technologies for developing weapons. So they've developed very effective weapons, effective in their own terms, fighting war, destroying property and killing people. But they haven't had enough engineering talent going into building railroads and trying to figure out how to make homes that were less expensive and more comfortable or safer and so on. The whole range of things. So the United States lost a lot of its technological lead in the areas of what you could call consumer or civilian life in favor of pulling those people into the military sector. The military sector, whatever else you can say about it, doesn't clothe anybody, it doesn't feed anybody, it doesn't provide for people's education, for the population in general. So when you distort the economy that way, when you take these people who are responsible for developing new products and finding better ways of making things to raise people's standard of living, and you put them to do something else, they don't do the consumer stuff. So, in effect, what I'm saying is the kinds of things that need to be done to fix the economy in the U.S. have to do with, first of all, rebuilding the manufacturing sector by pulling resources out of the sector that's doing military-related work. It simply doesn't, that sector doesn't contribute to the well-being of the population materially. And to put those resources, that labor, the skilled engineers and so on, back into civilian industry would do a lot for the U.S. That's the basic kind of fundamental stuff that needs to be done. We also have to stop paying people millions of dollars or billions of dollars for sitting in Wall Street offices and figuring out how to ruin the financial system, take advantage of it and damage American industry and American business that way.
In your opinion, why is money spent on war and not on improvement of life conditions for people?
One of the problems, in the United States there are a couple problems. One of them is that when the Second World War broke out, we finally pulled ourselves out of the Great Depression. So a lot of Americans reading about that history believe that war spending is the key to economic benefits. That's completely wrong. The reason that pattern was observed during the Second World War, the end of the Depression, was simply that the government, people were not spending money, so businesses couldn't operate, so they couldn't hire people, and so people didn't have any money to spend, and it went on and on. When you began to put money back in people's hands and take people for military purposes, do military-related jobs, the result was that they had at least a job, and in the short run, more money was going into the economy. The economy was building up, so people got this idea that that's what was good for them. But actually, if we had spent the same amount of money, the government had spent the same amount of money during Roosevelt's administration on fixing the roads or building national railroads or doing building better schools around the country, that would have had the same economic effect in the short term and a much better economic effect in the long term. We'd have something worthwhile. That's one of the reasons Americans have this idea that war spending is good for the economy. It's totally wrong. And another reason is we also have the idea that national security depends on force. That we care about being secure. Of course, people care about being secure. And we've gotten the idea that that's virtually the same thing as having a strong military. If you don't have a strong military, you can't push people around other countries, you're not secure. It's nonsense. The military actually has been very ineffective in pursuing the national interests of the United States. Look at Vietnam, look at Iraq. I mean, the list is long. Yes. So that's not true. That military is effective means of preserving national security. But it's even worse than that because the real means to economic security is building bridges between countries and intertwining their economies in ways that are balanced for all the peoples involved. I'm not saying the relationship should be balanced because it's a nice thing to do, because it works better. If you have balanced economic relationships, they reinforce each other rather than a relationship where some country is, for instance, pulling minerals out of the ground in another country and paying it next to nothing. That just gets people angry, and in the long term, it's very damaging to national security as well as to the economy itself.
Today we see that economy has taken a vector of consumer society. Do you see a need for change in today's economic system?
I think some producers are beginning to understand that we cannot, for ecological reasons, keep pulling resources out of the earth for an ever-expanding production of goods and services that people don't really need. In fact, more economists are probably the last ones to catch up on this, but they are beginning to realize also that it's not that utility, the pleasure in life, is what economists call utility, comes from other things, including in the work that you do. If you do work that is very other-directed and very helpful to other people, and work that's interesting to do, it's creative, it makes you think a lot, then you're likely to get a lot more joy out of the work you do than out of the stuff you're buying with the money you earn beyond what you need for a decent standard of living. So I think Americans, some of them are slowly learning the lesson that having more stuff is not the route to happiness. And in fact, for people who are very poor, that may be true that they need more stuff. But for a lot of the population, they're just trying to fill in the holes, the things that they can't achieve for themselves anymore, like feeling good. Instead, they feel depressed. And actually, I think I think that the most important thing for people to live a happy life in their own eyes, not my version of how you should be living, but their version. It has to do with relationships with other people and relationships with an activist. There was an activist named Laboratories, which is part of the new government. And since he wanted to do it, activists met for days with the management for him to do it. They didn't want to. That when the negotiation was finished and he finally had made a deal, as he was walking out as manager at the plant, sort of put his hand on his shoulder and he said, "You have no idea how many friends." What does that mean? These people are contributing to make, some of them would be a lot happier doing something else, building these horrendous weapons. Even the people doing it, they're earning money, but you shouldn't easily assume that they like happier, proud.
But, even the doomsday clock is 2 minutes to midnight. We're either 2 minutes away from climate disaster or nuclear, exploring something else that would help society. We're building nuclear weapons. In your opinion, how important is it to limit capital for individuals?
That's very interesting. The last book I wrote, which will be published in November of 2019, chapter called Limits and Incentives. And I argue that it is important to put limits on individual wealth, and we need these resources elsewhere, and we have to build societies that everybody participates. Economic wealth can be translated into political power. So if you have the ability to build up enormous amounts of the ability to, in effect, counter democracy by contributing to campaigns, by various means. But the people who are very rich can be very influential politically. And that's anti-democratic. It should not be true that because you have $1 billion, you now have much more say in how the country is governed than I do. So I wrote about that because I think it's an important point. It's also interesting I think it was the late 19th, no, it was the early 20th century. Andrew Carnegie, who was the steel magnate of the time, so to speak, the person who made tons of money making steel, wrote a book called Wealth. And in that book he says, this is a quote, "I would rather leave my son a stinking fish than the almighty dollar." He said, it's bad for people to inherit lots of wealth. And he said, if you do make a lot of money, you have to give it away. It's your obligation to society to give it, not just to give it to people on the street, but to give it to projects like Carnegie did with many libraries and concert halls and so on. He really believed that there should be 100% inheritance tax, because he said if you didn't do what you're supposed to do with your money, then the government would take your money when your life was over, and they would do with it what you should have done before. This is Andrew Carnegie. This is not some Marxist critic of capitalism. But he could see, that some people can see through this and understand that the lust for more and more is in itself a losing game.
Why is there an extreme impoverishment of some people and an enrichment of a limited circle of others?
First of all, I think people haven't learned the basic lesson that every human being should be treated like a person, not like an object. And as a result, people think it's all right to build their own wealth on the backs of other people who are suffering because they lack what you have in abundance. It's not even just a matter of morality. It is a matter of morality, but it's more than that. It's also that if you have a society of a few people who are very rich and a lot of people who are very poor, you cannot have as productive a society. You will not take advantage of the brain power, the ingenuity, the entrepreneurial sense of the people who never get a chance to do anything because they don't have enough resources. The richer people in the country will dominate the political life. It will, and often turns out not to be so wonderful for them either. I remember there's an area of Dallas where I live called, I don't live in this area, I live in Dallas, but this particular area is called Highland Park, and it's a very wealthy part of town. And I think since I've been in Texas, I have met more people who have, in quotes, made it in conventional terms, the big houses and so on, fancy cars, and are really unhappy. They have bad family lives. They don't see their life meaning much of anything. It's because they're looking in the wrong place for what they want. Creating a society where a few people step on everybody else is not